Hello everyone, this is Eva Nolik-Smith with YogaUOnline, and I'm very happy to be here today with Dr. Grace Bullock. Grace is a psychologist, yoga therapist, writer, and a research scientist who specializes in the integration of modern psychology with yoga therapy and mindfulness practices. Grace is particularly passionate about exploring ways that yoga and mindfulness practices can help us relieve psychological issues and also promote healthy relationships and even social change. Grace is the creator of a program called Breathe, 7 Skills for Successful Relationships, which we'll be hearing more about today. And as the name implies, the program focuses on how to incorporate the principles of yoga and mindfulness into relationships. And Grace, your yoga background includes extensive training in Vinyasa with Gary Kraftsov, is that correct?
That's true. Mm-hmm.
And you are also former editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy and faculty at the Integrated Health Yoga Therapy program, as well as a professor of yoga and neuroscience at the Taksha University School of Integrative Medicine. That's a lot of syllables, more than I can handle in one mouthful.
Not to mention working with you at Yoga.
Yes, which we're particularly proud of, to also call you the contributing editor of science and research at YogaUOnline. And if you have read any of our many articles on new studies on yoga, chances are that Grace is the author. So welcome, Grace. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eva, for having me. It's a real privilege.
So we are here to talk about what the ancient wisdom of yoga can teach us about something that is important to all of us, which is enjoying healthy relationships. Mm-hmm. So first of all, tell us about yourself and how you got interested in this topic.
Well, as a psychologist, my area of interest has always been working with couples, children, families, and adults around issues of adjustment primarily. And it's almost impossible to work with, folks as a psychologist without having relationship issues be probably the number one thing that emerges. So my interest in relationship started very early in my work as a psychologist and in my research looking at factors in families and sibling groups and peer groups that influenced whether or not children and adolescents became involved in antisocial behavior and substance use or experienced depression or anxiety. So it started very early.
So the influence of family, in essence.
Yeah, I mean, basically, this could be a very long conversation.
Right.
But the way that we meet the world, the way that we think about ourselves and others and our relationships emerges very early in life based on, some things that we take for granted, like the stories we're told about ourselves, the stories we're told about our families. We develop what I call a self-schema early on in life, and so if you reflect back on your childhood, there's a good chance that there are personal stories that you carry with you forward, like you're the good girl, or you're the troublemaker, or you're the one who pleases everyone or takes care of everyone, or the black sheep. So we learn all these stories very early, and we test them out over and over again in our early relationships with family and caregivers, but those stories tend to greatly influence how we approach and respond to others as we mature. And often by the time we reach adulthood, those stories become tucked away in our unconscious, and we're not really aware of the fact that we use those stories and those ideas as lenses through which we filter our experiences in our adult lives.
Interesting. There is that old saying that people at one point in their time, in their relationship, discover that they have become their mother or become their father, and they're basically carrying out all those same habits that they grew up with, that their parents had, in terms of how they interacted.
Absolutely. And, where this comes into play in particular is when we're under stress. So, our culture is such that we are, generally speaking, under a tremendous amount of psychological stress, which takes its toll on our physiology. And as I know you're aware, we have the fight, flight, and freeze system, which in many of our cases is activated on a continuous basis because we're living in states of chronic stress. And when we're in these states of chronic stress, what emerges is that we tend to be physiologically active, and I can talk about that a little bit more, but also we tend to operate from our limbic system, which is our emotional brain. And when our emotional brain is in a state of high activity, we lose the capacity to tap into resources like listening, effective communication, problem solving, planning, reasoning, memory. Those resources become less available to us, and we tend to be more reactive. So often, that's why sometimes people say, when I'm at work, I'm really calm and I'm planful and I'm organized. And when I get home, it just feels like I'm a completely different person. And
Right.
some of that is contextual, in that in some places we can use those parts of our brains, we can access those parts of our brains to be what I would like to think is the person that we inherently are. And in other places that are characterized by a high degree of emotional reactivity, we tend to bring that reactivity in terms of our physiology and in terms of our brains into that equation, which makes us more emotionally and behaviorally reactive. So
Interesting.
these stories that we have early on in our childhood, we carry them with us, but we become less and less aware of how those stories are playing out, or how we're filtering other people's behavior through those lenses when we're highly
Right.
stressed. And that's where the yoga and the mindfulness piece comes into play.
Interesting. Yeah, along those same lines, I mean, you could say stress is kind of hardwired into our system. And, if you're stressed, you can't just turn it off, particularly if you're under pressure from work or in a difficult family situation.
Mhm.
And I'm sure we all have had the experience that there are times when you react in ways that you didn't really want to react, but you can't just like not react like that. So what do you do in a situation like that?
Well, I think, some of it, just understanding that comes back to understanding our physiology. And Robert Sapolsky wrote the book, which many of us have read, called "Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers."
Mm-hmm.
And looking at animal models of behavior, when animals are under threat, they experience the threat, they either fight or they flee or they freeze, and it's they hopefully they survive it, but
Mm-hmm.
once the event occurs, the event is gone.
Mm-hmm.
um, Humans, on the other hand, can keep the stress response alive purely as a function of our minds. So our bodies can't discriminate between whether we're running from a zebra or whether we're creating that scenario in our minds. Our physiology, our autonomic nervous system, those parts of our brains and our bodies still respond as
Mm-hmm.
if we are being chased. And so when we're in that chronic state of arousal, what happens is we're literally preparing ourselves for battle, or we're preparing ourselves to hide, or we're preparing ourselves to run. And in terms of our personal relationships, that can be really that can work to our disadvantage, because it doesn't matter how someone approaches us. If, for example, you say something to me and my personal story is that, Eva doesn't like me, it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter how nice and pleasant you are, I can interpret through my lens every one of your actions as you not liking me.
Mm-hmm.
And that will create a state of physiological arousal, or if I'm
Mm-hmm.
already stressed, that magnifies. And
Right.
so I'll respond to you as if you don't like me, because
Interesting.
that's how I see the world. And if I'm
Right.
really, really stressed, I can't sit down and say, that's my story. That may
Right.
not be true in this particular situation, because I
Yeah.
can't access those parts of my mind that can process that information or make those discriminations.
Right.
So a lot of it comes down to a lack of awareness, which makes us, what I say, mindless, not mindful.
Right. Right. Yeah, so how can we learn to recognize those stories and how can we learn to step out of them?
Mhm.
Does it start with the mind and how we interpret things, or does it start with the nervous system and our state of arousal, which I guess relates to how stressed we are?
That's an excellent question, and that's exactly where the breathe idea came into play. Is that, in my work early on, particularly in psychology, as a psychologist, I worked with a lot of disadvantaged families, and we would use approaches with parents who were highly, highly stressed because their children were breaking the law or they were being kicked out of school, and
Hmm.
we would use approaches with them that required them to enact specific skills or a specific set of steps.
Hmm.
And more often than not, a lot of parents would come back week after week and just say, I can't do this. I can't do this. And at the time, it never occurred to me that in some ways we were fighting a losing battle, because they were so physiologically aroused and so stressed out that they couldn't mobilize the resources that they needed in order to do that type of planful work.
Hmm.
So, over years of watching this play out, and as my own personal yoga and meditation practice evolved and my yoga therapy training occurred, it became quite obvious to me that if we don't intervene at the physiological level, in some ways we're banging our head against the wall, because the message is, it's kind of like trying to permeate a membrane. Little bits and pieces will go in. But if
Hmm.
people are repeatedly experiencing failure because they're being told you need to do this and they can't
Hmm.
because of their stress level, then we're actually just perpetuating a feedback loop of people failing.
Hmm.
So the number one way I think that we can intervene with the stress cycle is by modifying our breath,
Hmm.
because the breath, without getting into too much detail, our autonomic nervous system is divided into two primary branches. One is the sympathetic nervous system, which acts like the gas pedal. So when we're trying to jump out of the way of an oncoming car, it comes in rapidly and mobilizes us for action. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is like the brake pedal. So after that event occurs,
Hmm.
the brake pedal slowly comes on, and then we return back to our state of calm. The autonomic function deals with things that are involuntary, like our heart, our respiration, our pupil dilation, digestion, and other functions, most of which are not in our conscious control. So, there are stories of sages and sadhus who could, slow their heart rate down, but most of us can't do that. But what we can do is we can modulate our breath consciously.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of ancient and contemporary research that shows that if we slow down our rate of respiration and we deepen it, particularly the exhalation, we can help to stimulate parasympathetic nervous system functioning,
Hmm.
essentially putting the brakes on our stress response. And once we're able to do that, we are able to access the parts of our brain that are more adept at listening, communicating effectively,
Interesting.
problem solving, and that can help us to recognize and become aware of how we use our personal stories to react to people in real life situations. So the breath
Yeah.
is the number one way, or modifying the breath is the number one way to get that stress response down to a place where we can begin to use other cognitive behavioral skills that occur in modern psychotherapy, and use those skills to improve and enhance our relationships.
Hmm. So when you call your program Breathe, I presume it's an acronym?
It is an acronym. And let's see, I should know this inside and out. So B is the breath. You know what? Just to make sure I don't completely botch this, I am going to pull it up. B is the breath. R is recognizing the signs of stress, so recognizing physiologically when we're feeling arousal. E is embracing our emotional cues. So without getting into too much detail, there's a great paper actually on your website about emotion mapping.
Right.
And most of us experience certain types of emotion, pain we experience in our heart. Sometimes anger we experience as our head pulsating or our
Right.
gut wrenching. So just becoming attuned to those emotional cues can help us to become aware of our experience. So that's E. A is using appraisal. So that's kind of when we look at how we appraise situations, are we using our personal story, or are we able to appraise them in a way that doesn't use that story as a lens to filter the experience through? T is taking time. So the art of the purposeful pause. We
Yeah.
are a culture of people who rush in and problem solve and fix things, and it's very difficult to become thoughtful and planful and mindful if we're rushing. So we need to pause and create space in order to evaluate our experience. Um, H is one of my personal favorites, using humor. I think it's really easy to have this conversation and get very serious and get very self-critical and think that we need to master this and we need to be really good at it. And one of the things that I teach as a yoga educator, but also as part of my personal practice, is learning how to get up and giggle and laugh when you fall down, because it's inevitably going to happen.
Right.
And if we beat ourselves up, we're just magnifying our stress.
Yeah.
And if we can cut ourselves some slack, we can actually not perpetuate the stress cycle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then E is engaging others in a new and different way. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. So yeah, so that's the acronym of breathe. But it all begins with the breath. It all begins with diffusing our sympathetic nervous system overload so that we can tap into our best selves and begin to think through what we're doing rather than react.
And this is where the yoga integration, I mean, obviously you're also applying a lot of concepts from yoga philosophy, but the yoga practices, is it primarily breathing practices you are using?
It's primarily breathing practices initially, but there are, obviously yoga philosophy, the yamas and niyamas are rich with tradition about engaging each other in right action and respectful discourse. And so, the yoga tradition clearly influences my thinking. But there are also, when I was working with some moms early on, when I first started working with people and thinking about yoga therapy, a lot of what I was teaching was movement. But I kept having this image pop into my head of a mom with a 2-year-old in a grocery store who needs to figure out how to calm herself down. And I thought to myself, this mom can't drop into downward dog or start doing Surya Namaskar A. So I
Right.
have to think about other tools that can be useful. And
Yeah.
right around that time, I had the privilege of spending a little time with Joseph LePage and reading his book on mudra. And it occurred to me that we can also use mudra, and it doesn't have to be a formal mudra, but just some symbol to create a paired association between relaxation
Interesting.
and a situation. So some people, you just see them automatically, they put their hands together when they're trying to calm down.
Right, right.
That might be seen as too religious for some. So I encourage people to create symbols for themselves, physical symbols that they can tap into that are
Right.
associated with slow intentional breathing. And another wonderful tool is mantra.
Mm.
Just saying to yourself over and over again, I got this, or I'm not going to respond in a stressful way, or my personal favorite, breathe. When I'm stressed, it's like, breathe, breathe.
Right,
And
right.
so sometimes just the use of a desired phrase or mantra, as we call it in the yoga tradition, can be an incredibly effective tool for diffusing stress if it's something we practice on a regular basis. So it
Mm.
becomes part of our repertoire as opposed to something we're trying to pull out of a hat when we're stressed, which, as you can imagine, probably isn't the best time to give it a try.
Right. So when you say breathing techniques, I presume you're not talking about complicated, demanding pranayama breathing. You more a simple breath that will help you tune into your body and calm the mind.
Absolutely. I think that the breath techniques that we learn or we need to learn as a culture are those that we can practice, let's say, under the radar
Yeah, yeah.
in any context.
Right.
And I think just very, very deep intentional breathing can be one of those tools that we can use anywhere, and it's portable and it's free, and it has a similar effect to pharmaceuticals that also slow us down. But it and the other piece of the breath is that one of the things I discovered when I began to really investigate the breath after having a really after being hospitalized for a very serious asthmatic incident was that I began to really pay attention to other people's breathing,
Hmm.
because it's something that becomes very salient after you
Right.
have a traumatic experience around it. And one of the things I noticed at the time with clients was that most of us breathe in our upper respiratory tract.
Hmm.
And from a physiological perspective, short or rapid breath feeds back into our autonomic nervous system and our brains that we're under threat. And when we're
Hmm.
under threat, it triggers sympathetic nervous system
Right.
activation, which shortens our breath because it's preparing us to run or fight or flee. So
Yeah.
we're breathing in a way that also tends to perpetuate the chronic stress response.
Right.
And one of the most effective ways to um, diffuse that or to get out of that chronic feedback loop is to change the way we breathe,
Hmm.
because we can.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's
yeah.
not that difficult. Although I do need to put a little caveat to that, in that when I first started studying yoga many years ago, I went to a pranayama workshop. And as someone with, a chronic respiratory disease, I had very, very severe asthma for, well, I still do, but it was much worse at the time. Um, I would try to do pranayama, and I would find it, even just, deep breathing or ujjayi breathing, even before getting into, alternate nostril breathing. Just the basic act of breathing deeply for me was extremely anxiety provoking.
Hmm.
And it had the opposite effect, because once I became aware of my shallow breath, it scared me.
Hmm.
And so trying to deepen my shallow breath scared me even more. So I had this paradoxical effect in that trying to breathe
Right.
more deeply created more anxiety.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a one size fits all equation. And for some people, we need to be very, pardon me, we need to be very mindful about how we introduce intentional breathing, because it may trigger for them the
Right.
opposite effect.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
don't want to make this sound like it's, a magic pill, because it
Right.
works for, I would say, a great majority of people, but for some people, it requires a different approach.
Yeah. And I think it's like any yoga asana, you have to meet people where they are. But
Absolutely.
there's a great art to finding out where they are and which version of the pose or the breath that will be suited to anyone at a given time.
Absolutely.
Now, as you started developing this program and started using it with your clients, what was some of the feedback that you got?
It actually was very parallel to feedback I received yesterday. I taught this approach to third graders, a series of third graders at a conference yesterday. It was the first time I've worked with groups of kids that young, so you can only imagine what that was like. And some kids said that was really weird, and some kids, a lot of them said it was really, really relaxing. They felt like they were maybe going to go to sleep if they kept doing it. They thought it was really useful. They could see using it if they were doing a test, for example.
Right, right.
So the typical response is that people feel relaxed. And what amazed me when I started just working with the breath as a primary technique of yoga therapy was how rapid the response was, but also how profoundly and deeply people could achieve states of relaxation in a relatively short period of time. And how for most people, at least the way I was teaching it, it was pretty easy and accessible to them, including
Yeah.
these third graders who couldn't figure out which hand was which, but they still they still were able to figure it out. And
That's so cute.
yeah, it was.
So, in essence, what you're saying is we can kind of learn how to hardwire our nervous system and our brain in a different way and change our habits of response over time.
Well, I think like any yoga practice, we're dealing with the vast potential of neuroplasticity. And so if we do a practice repeatedly, I don't want to say it becomes overlearned because that makes it sound a little too behavioral, but if we practice it repeatedly, it becomes a tool that we can access fairly readily, as opposed to we only wait until we're in the middle of that argument. It's like, oh yeah, she said to breathe. Let's see if I can breathe now.
Right.
So I think that with, just like any new skill, if we practice it, it becomes part of our repertoire. And
Right.
I don't know if there are any data. In fact, I don't think there are any long-term studies of looking at these practices. But my guess would be like, you see muscle elongation and neural repatterning with physical movement in yoga. My guess would be, and just judging from my own, experience with increased lung capacity, that over time, as you continue practicing intentional breathing, and it becomes part of your way of being, that you do have greater access to it. And I would like to think that the same applies if we become more aware of our level of stress, how that affects us emotionally, which stories it triggers.
Yeah.
I mean, now I can say, okay, this is happening. This is the story that's playing out for me.
Right.
This isn't true for me now. And then make a conscious choice not to react,
Yeah. Yeah.
5-year-old. Because a lot of those stories, they're the person we were when we were kids, and
Right.
the
Right.
behaviors we learned around the stories were child behavior,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we still react emotionally and behaviorally like we did when we were 5. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
takes a lot of unlearning to
Yeah.
unlearn
Tell
patterns
me
of
about
behavior.
it.
Yeah. But it's
But
possible.
yeah, these are just such hugely important skills. Certainly for relationships, but for all of life. And um, I think it's one of the nice things about getting older that you get to know yourself. And you kind of start understanding, how you tend to create problems for yourself by overreacting or interpreting things in a way that you later realize, well, it really wasn't correct. And I always wish that I could kind of dial back 20, 30, 2 or 3 decades and just kind of like know all that stuff when I was younger. How nice would that have been?
Or we've been
Um,
introduced to yoga when we were 5 instead of, 35 or 45. But
yeah, yeah, and you
I
kind
figure
of.
better late than never. And and part of my motivation for doing this too is not just to have it apply to intimate personal relationship or friends and family, but my larger vision is, and it goes far beyond this work, but my larger vision would be that if we, if we treat each other with kindness and respect, if we're aware of our behavior, if we're managing our stress, we're putting out loving kindness into the world, and that will feed forward. And hopefully, if there are enough of us doing that, particularly in this day and age, I mean, let's face it, it's challenging times, that by example, we can show alternatives to aggression. We can show alternatives that are based more on the principles of loving kindness, and the philosophies that were taught to us in the Bhagavad Gita and other places. So my hope is to, with creating one less reactive human at a time, we will have a ripple effect and create a kinder, more compassionate world.
Yes. And you will be teaching us that in your course coming up soon. We rely on you.
Oh, but we'll start with one person in one breath at a time.
So give us a brief overview of your course. And I mean, you already sort of been talking about what you will be talking about, but maybe a little bit more specifics, what we can expect.
Sure. And, a 2-hour course, as you can imagine, is a brief snapshot of a much larger picture. And it's almost kind of like an excerpt from the book on this that is nearly written. But we'll focus on the key points: the physiology of stress, the relationship between the breath and the stress response. There's a really good, I'll leave this as a teaser, but there's some phenomenal research about the physiology of a relationship that I haven't talked about, that I think is
Cool.
absolutely mind-blowing in the context of why this work matters. So I'll definitely be talking about that. And then, explore a little bit about our stories, how we can use body awareness to tap into our emotional experience, and just try to bring it all together and give people tools to play with, essentially resources to explore.
Great, wonderful. Well, Grace, thank you so much for joining us. It was great talking with you, and you have so many skills, and we have been really enjoying your writing for a long time, so we're very, very pleased we also get to benefit from your brilliance in this particular area and a new side of you that we haven't had a chance to get to know before. So we're very much looking forward to the course, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this work. So thanks so much, Eva.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.